a few different items. I'll breeze through everything, and then I'll have questions. I'll take questions at the end. If there is a urgent thing that I'm missing or something that you want to bring up, feel free. We lost our audio visual. I just
He's
turned
pointing to something, but I don't know what he's pointing at.
Okay. You just meant then? Okay. Well, the one thing I'll mention, I'll give you an update of a different sort while we're waiting for this to come back online. The one thing I did do here a few minutes ago is drop off petitions with Ann Stevens for the Skyview at Block 49, Phase 1 and Phase 2 improvements. We're only going to do Phase 1 right now, but we're going to get going on that project, and it's 20 acres all at once. So that's a pretty nice sized project that's coming up. So just dropped that off here just a few minutes ago. So anyway, jumping back into this, I'm going to give an update on Aurora Park, Hillcrest, Cozy Drive, and Eagle Lake tonight. We were contracted by the city a few months ago to look at these 4 different projects. The Aurora Park, Hillcrest, and Cozy Drive projects are focusing on primarily street ditch culvert evaluations to see what recommendations we have out there and identifying issues that we've seen. The Eagle Lake outfall is looking more at evaluating the outfall to the lake. Is it adequate? What changes needed to be made, and going from there. So I'll give you some information tonight, and then we'll probably be looking for some feedback as far as what direction to go on a few items that I'll discuss tonight. So first project I'm going to be talking about is the Aurora Park drainage improvements, and you can see on the drawing there on the screen that they're highlighted in red, the streets that we looked at the street ditches and culverts on. We didn't do a full study of Fawn Lake at this point in time. That wasn't requested of us, but I've been looking a little bit at that, and I'll have more information as time goes on as we get deeper into plans as far as recommendations we might have. But for right now, we're concentrating on street ditches and culverts on this. The ditches, we surveyed the entire site. I know that I had some folks who were disgruntled because the flags were out there for an awful long time. And if you do have anybody out there who still has flags in the yard in the Aurora Park neighborhood, you can remove them without any harm coming our way. So just starting out with the ditches and looking at it, the ditches that are shown in green on this screen are ditches that they need to be regraded. They're all the ditches on the site are 6 inches or more, 6 to 8 inches higher than they should be based on the culverts out there. There's been that much sedimentation, turf buildup, and other issues that have taken the ditches where they're no longer at the proper grade. So the areas in green that we have shown there on the map are areas where we can just do regrading. We don't expect to have major issues with it. The areas that are blue, kind of at the fringes of the development, those are areas where there's driveways that don't have culverts right now. And that's because they're at the upstream ends of basins. There's very little flow to them. The soils out on this side are hydrologic soil group B soils, which means they're well drained. So you don't have water just sitting around all the time, typically in this kind of soil. So when these roads were built, ditches weren't put in, and it's kind of they're not necessarily. Now, if somebody wanted to have a ditch, there's adequate grade to build ditches out there. But as we'll see in a little bit, this project gets pretty expensive as it is. So that's one of the things that'll have to be decided, is whether or not those areas in blue should be upgraded to have ditches and culverts in those areas. The areas that are red, which is over here on Parkwood Lane, this is a really super flat area. The areas that are red are really flat ditches where you have to worry about not having good flow along the ditch, possibility of probably a slightly higher possibility of standing water, increased chances for sedimentation, maybe harder to maintain because the ground gets spongier in those areas. And so this area here on Parkwood, there is no relief ditch. There's a relief ditch cut in here at this end up here, but the rest of the way down through there, that ditch is dead flat. It probably only falls 1 foot in 500 or 600 feet. So it's like under 0.1% grade, and it's actually irregular. It goes up and down a little bit. So the drainage in that ditch is really poor. So one of the things to consider is whether or not a relief ditch should be cut out between one of the houses out there. I met with Ann on site and we looked at it, and of course the catch for that is this subdivision's been built for a long time. Anywhere you go, you're going to be impacting somebody's property, either landscaping or some other improvements they've done in the back. In one area, there was a power pole that would end up maybe needing to be relocated. So that's kind of a tough area to figure out. Is it worth the issue to try and cut that through as far as getting into somebody's yard? We're not recommending it this time because the soils are well drained. And I asked Ann, and there's not a history of people reporting any kind of flooding issues with their homes or anything. So the water builds up enough head to push the water out to the north, but it isn't optimal. This area down here at 39th Street and Harding, I had Hyacinth on my mind for just a moment there. But at 39th and Harding, the pipes crossing this street are undersized for the situation that's going on there. And I'm sure the residents can attest to the fact that the road probably overtops pretty routinely. We normally size culverts under driveways for a 10-year storm event. In subdivisions like this, it's pretty routine for culverts to be 25-year storm events. And I know I talked with one of the residents, and they had mentioned they see it more like every couple of years. It's probably it's probably as frequent as every few years it overtops. The primary design was with 3 culverts going diagonally across there into a ditch that runs behind the homes and then out through the RCB that's under 37th Street. At some point in time, it looks like somebody identified that it was undersized, so they added another pipe under 39th to help take some of the load off the road, but it's not quite enough. So it probably, of course, the last 10 years, we've had a lot of fairly intense storms. So what's a 25-year storm nowadays? So whether or not it's still designed for the 25-year, it probably technically is according to the standards that are out there, but whether or not in practical purposes it is. So we're recommending to get that cleaned up, and we'll probably look at putting in an additional pipe going across the way there. The one thing that has happened, because the extra culvert pipe was put here, these ditches have been subjected to more water than they should be. And so I know that there's a history of flooding of the area drain down there. And so the ditches on that side of Harding down there are undersized and need to be opened up a little bit more. And then looking at the culverts, do we need to put larger culverts? And I'll talk about that more in a second. So that's just a quick breeze through on the ditches. Like I said, most of the ditches are 6 to 8 inches built up over the years with sedimentation and turf buildup. On the culvert side, the culverts that are green are culverts that are adequately sized for the 10-year storm. So a lot of these culverts out here are adequately sized. We did run into a couple over here that were not. The 2 little stars, they're hard to see at this scale, but the ones with the stars next to them, they may be adequately sized, but they're reverse slope. So either they weren't put in properly to start with, or settlement over the years. I heard somebody telling me that some of the backfill on the roadways was a little suspect, so I don't know if that had a factor in it. But anywhere you see the double stars means that there's been settlement that have caused the culverts where they aren't draining the proper direction. But the green ones are culverts that we identified as adequately sized. Red ones are red because they're typically too small. In a couple instances, you can tell it's because somebody added a culvert in. Like in this instance here, there's a garage or a shed here. It looks like there was a culvert added to access that, and they didn't put in the right size culvert. It's I think it's an 18-inch culvert, and there's a 30-inch culvert right next to it. So it's clearly not the right culvert for the job. And then same kind of thing on this one. This is a much smaller culvert than the rest of the ones on the street. The blue areas here, those are, I mentioned earlier, no street ditch or no street ditch and no driveway culverts in those areas of blue that are kind of at the perimeters of the site. And what you run into on that is it kind of turns into does the property owner want to have a culvert in their front yard? Some people may value having a culvert in their front yard to keep the water off their yard. Some people may say, no, I'd rather have a flat front yard, so if I have friends over, they can park in front of my house easier in the grass and adjacent to the roadway. So it's one of those things that some people may not want to have a culvert in their yard. So before we would finalize plans, I think we'd want to have a discussion with a little bit more discussion as far as whether or not that's something we want to get into, is opening up ditches and creating the culverts or not. We don't necessarily recommend it based on what I've seen. I don't know that I would recommend adding culverts just to add them. Like I mentioned earlier, this area drain here, with this pipe being added in, it's an overflow pipe, so I've got it marked as green because it's just an overflow pipe. This inlet gets overwhelmed with all the water that's coming up, and my theory on it is that the designer of 37th Street, when they did this, they see this pond, they see these pipes, they see this big channel going behind there. They didn't factor in the extra water that's coming through that pipe. And so there's more water reaching that area drain than they had anticipated in their design. And so what we'd recommend on this is, I think a fairly easy fix is to just take the lid, remove it, clean everything up, and put spacers in there to turn it into more of a field drain, so you can have the whole perimeter of the inlet to dump into it in heavier storm events. Because right now with the flat top, just the minorest amount of brush and debris, if it gets 30% clogged, it gets completely overwhelmed and floods. If you do more of a raise it up 4 to 6 inches, it's much harder for that area drain to plug. And we think that would solve where you didn't have to have your crews rush out there every time it rains to make sure it's not covered up.
What's the estimated cost of just making that one change there?
I budgeted $10,000
To make the one change. Okay.
to make the one change.
All right.
It's really hard to say. It depends on when they remove it, how it comes off, if you have any issues with it. We did an inlet top adjustment in one of our additions a while back where we had to convert an inlet from a regular inlet to a driveway gutter inlet, and it was $8,500. So, and that was a few years ago. So we budgeted $10,000 for it. But it is one of those things that that inlet is routinely overwhelmed. The other side of the street is not as much of a problem, even though water does make its way down there from the north on this side too. But there is an overflow cut that was cut over to the channel to give the water an escape route on the other side of the road. So it's really only the east side of the road that has a problem. So like I said, the blue circles are areas where it's more of probably a property owner decision as much as anything else. Maybe you want to provide some input on that. I think folks, when it starts coming to spending money to put in culverts, are probably not going to be as excited about it. There is one driveway here that we found that doesn't have a culvert. It's pretty near a high spot, but we're recommending that if we're going to go through and regrade, that we do add a culvert back in on this lot here. And then I guess I should mention one of the other problems that was identified to start the project is up here on Parkwood Lane. There's a culvert that was put right in the middle of somebody's front yard, and it drains 6 or 7 acres of water that just runs right into their front yard instead of towards a property line or towards a corner. So we met with Ann out there, and we do agree that culvert should be relocated to more of a property corner type thing. And in particular, if we did make a decision to cut in a swale, you'd want to relocate that culvert to match wherever that outlet swale would go. So Aurora Park, we went through and did a cost estimate on it. That's our estimated cost to do the project. That does include all of the costs to the project, including any staking that would need to be done, construction observation, contingencies in case the costs were to increase. We hate being the low bidder on projects. So it does include everything. I did not include the culverts that were in blue. Adding those in would probably add another $39,000 to $40,000 to the project. So a 10% increase to add those additional culverts in there. There's a lot of different ways to pay for this. The numbers at the bottom are just something I put together just for, at this point is just for perspective. It's not a recommendation. It's just saying this is what it would cost. If this was paid 100% by the folks that live on the addition that live along the roads that are being impacted, there's 86 lots that would be affected. The average cost is $4,500 a lot roughly, which is $24 a month over 20 years. So it's a lot of money. Now, again, that's not a recommendation. That's just for perspective on cost on the project as far as what you'd be looking at to do that. We included replacing any reverse slope culverts. That price includes reverse culverts with reverse slopes. It includes any culverts that might be damaged and undersized culverts as well. So I'll just take a pause. I guess I'll take a pause right here and see if you guys have any questions about it.
One question that occurred to me when I was reading through this material the other day is that this one inlet that you're recommending making the change is about $10,000. That looks like the contractor on 37th Street, probably either the contractor or the engineer or both, made an error there.
I would definitely say, I wouldn't say it was a contractor. I'm sure they built what was designed. So
Okay.
You could make the argument that the engineer on the project didn't get the drainage area right. Like I said, when you look at it, there's a large channel. When you look here on this, in this area, if there's a channel that runs right through here, that's supposed to be the route for the water for there. If you only include the area that's on the south side of 39th, that area inlet would be fine. But it is one of those things that there's more water making it there. And to some degree, it may be even irrelevant because the road overtops. So in the larger storm events, maybe it's even irrelevant that pipe was pointed that way. It's one of those things that hindsight's always 20/20, but there's definitely not inlet capacity to handle all the storm water that goes there. Particularly, the other thing that was done is they chose, and this is kind of a city of Wichita thing, they went to more of a flat top design. They used to do rounded top inlets where we call them beehive inlets, and they don't use those anymore. They quit using those because what happens is on those, people would go, oh, I can fill my yard up to the top of the beehive, and they'd end up completely blocking them. So they quit using those because they got tired of people. It was routine. People would say, my yard's flooding. I need I've got a problem. And you go out there and their inlet's buried. And it's like, well, start by grading your yard. So they quit using those, but those flatter inlets are more prone to get blocked, and they're easier for leaves and branches and stuff to start to reduce their capacity. So from my conversations with Ann, when the inlet is cleared out, it performs pretty well in most storm events. It's just if there's any kind of clogging at all, it quickly floods over the street and causes a lot of problems. So
she has to watch the weather forecast and run a crew out there every time looks like it's going to have significant rain.
So
right?
It's a combination of, it's probably the clogging combined with as much as anything else, but something needs to be done to that inlet to reduce it. And I think it's a fairly easy fix to take care of that as far as that goes. So any other questions?
Mr. Mayor.
Yes, Mr. Smith.
I was just going to ask on projects like this where you're looking at drainage for an area, because this would be a large project. Is it possible to do this in phases, or is this type of project something that you would have to do all at once?
No, you could easily, there might be spots that are natural breaking points for phases, but if you wanted to do this in pieces, there's certainly areas you could identify to do that. In general, what I would say on that is you'd want to start at the south end where that's the lowest point, because we're cutting And since we're cutting, you'd want to start at the downstream end and cut your way up. Because if you started at the upstream end, you'd end up creating holes. So you could certainly do it in pieces if you were so inclined to do that. There'd be no reason you wouldn't do that, as long as you started at the south end and worked your way upstream.
So your report talked about a TRM, and I think some of this area along Harding there, you were recommending that you would install this TRM. Could you help us understand better what that is and what your proposal is to do?
Yeah. TRM it's turf reinforcement mat, and there's a lot of different products out there and a lot of different ways to accomplish it. But essentially what they are is they're typically some kind of a plastic mat, whether they be a mesh or like a honeycomb matrix or whatever, that you install when you're regrading the ditch to try and bridge any wet or softer soils, because the flatter the soil is, the more likely it is to be when it's wet, it's gonna, your mower or whatever is gonna sink into it. So the turf reinforcement mats, when you get into flatter slopes, particularly under 0.5% grade, are a way to help reduce, rutting and those kind of things that might happen. The good thing about a site like this, where the TRMs are, probably recommended for grades under 0.5%, but maybe not absolutely required, is the soil types out here are such that the water soaks in pretty well. Because when I drove out there, the only place where I saw water running in the ditch out of here, because we walked it here just a week and a half ago or so, there was no water in any of the ditches up here. The only water was where it was coming out of the outfall and running down the roadway there. And that soil does get so saturated there that it does stay wet. But of course, that's also potentially where this water is making its way past Harding and down to there. So it's the most likely candidate for TRM. Honestly, it's one of those things that if the property owners there don't have problems mowing it, it kind of gets into it. Is it worth I think I had budgeted $34,000 for TRMs. It is a place to save some money if you want to go ahead and just leave the existing condition be in terms of that. The situation won't be any worse than it is, and so they're recommended but not required.
Did I read in the report something about some problems with mowers in these TRMs?
Well, that's the one catch on the TRMs that you have to be very careful about, is you do want to make sure your contractor installs them right, pins them down properly, because particularly where you have grade breaks occurring, if they aren't pinned properly, a mower blade can catch them and pull them out and make a mess. So installation is important on that. You want to make sure they are pinned down properly if they're used.
So it's really a function of good installation, not a function of homeowner, be careful of this TRM.
Yeah, if it's installed properly, it significantly reduces the chances of a problem. Now, it doesn't mean that a homeowner can't catch it accidentally if they turn their mower wrong at the wrong spot. You can still catch them a little bit, because that happens, but certainly installation is the biggest issue.
Okay.
So the one thing I'll just kind of finish up with on this is I only have briefly looked at this. It wasn't part of our scope of services, but I did look at it, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later too. But one of the things that was commented on was that folks in this area were noticing that as houses were built in Eagle Lake, the runoff was increasing, and there were some complaints that maybe the pond outflow wasn't designed properly. And what I'm seeing in my initial review of it is when we design a detention pond, what we normally do is we'll look at the pre-developed condition. What was it like before any lake or pond was there? What was the runoff like? And then compare that to the developed condition where you have the lake, you have all the houses. And in that respect, the Eagle Lake outflow is below the pre-developed runoff rates based on what I checked. The catch, and where this one gets complicated, is I'm pretty sure that Eagle Lake started out its life as a farm pond where it's been there a long time, where, what is, at that point, it's a chicken or egg thing. What is the pre-developed condition? What are you designing for at that point as a designer? And so I don't have any idea how the designers of Eagle Lake were looking at it, But there could be the perception, since there was already a farm pond there, the lake gets upgraded, it gets resized, it gets a new outfall, runoff drops dramatically. As houses build up, the runoff starts to increase pretty dramatically over time as all those houses were built. So I guarantee that anybody living out there has a perception that there's a lot more water running out of there than before. Again, it kind of runs into that chicken and egg thing of what was the pre-developed condition that the designer should have been designing for. And part of what we may talk about too is, do we want to mess with our outfall and further reduce the runoff to try and help downstream property owners see a little less water? That's one of those things we can talk about when we get later on. But I just wanted to mention while we're talking about Aurora Park that I guarantee that the perception with the way this project developed over time, I guarantee the perception of the water increasing substantially is real. Now, again, pre-developed versus developed, that's where it gets a little murkier. So any other questions about Aurora Park?
I have heard from some residents who've lived out there for a long time that was a farm pond,
Yeah.
Beagle Lake.
Yeah. Oh, one other thing I guess I should mention, and maybe some of the folks in the room here could attest to it, there's a significant variation in opinion of whether or not this project is necessary or not. My survey crew's got all sorts of feedback on on that. There's a few folks who really want to see stuff done. There's some folks who would prefer that their yards get left alone. So I think that's once you get closer to wanting to move ahead on the project, maybe having some kind of a public meeting to kind of gauge that is probably an appropriate route to take. Okay. Is to get some actual public feedback in some kind of an open forum to, surveys and those kind of things to kind of get a feel for what people are wanting to do, what areas are important, where the complaints are at, where people are happy. Because for one thing, it might save you a significant amount of money on the work you're doing out there. Is if we do find out that the folks here really, they would rather have you leave their yards alone, and these folks here would rather have you leave the yards alone, that kind of starts to bear out that you do want to leave those yards alone. If they say, hey, I really want to see that, if we're spending this much money, I'd like to see a culvert, that'd be some good feedback. So,
but the areas in blue currently have no drainage in part of this system.
Yeah, there's no culverts in any of those areas right now.
No ditches?
Most of them don't even have ditches. If there is a ditch, it's like 4 or 6 inches, just a real gradual low spot beside the road. But with the soil types there are, and particularly over here on 40th Street there, it's got a fairly good slope going downhill, so the water doesn't stick around. It just runs right across driveways. There's not a large drainage area, so I don't see a lot of evidence of sand or driveways washing out. I don't see any problems like that looking at it. Again, I'm doing a snapshot in time there. The homeowners there may be doing maintenance that I'm not aware of. But
the water's running down the road. Are we having to regrade those roads more frequently, or do we have a feel for that?
There's a ditch on the side of the road, so it's not running right down the road. It's running in the grass swales besides the roads. But
we grade all of the roads in that area at the same time. We don't give one road more attention than others.
Okay.
I guess one more thing. In the report, one of my recommendations is, and there'll be loud booing coming from behind me here in a minute, is the best thing and the proper thing to do is to get rid of these sand streets completely and pave them. That's really what should happen. That would be the right solution to really fix it. But you could easily double the cost of this project and maybe triple the cost of this project to do that kind of work. And obviously, if you're starting to talk about it's going to cost me $100 a month to get my road paved, understandable that people don't need to have extra burden on them cost wise. So I just wanted to mention that that's really the proper long-term solution, is to get rid of the sand streets completely. But I don't believe that that's even worth belaboring at this time. So
another question I had is, I'll just kind of express this and you can kind of correct me, but it seems like with water runoff, you kind of need to like have this plan, right? This plan, this is how it all works, and different people wanting different things makes it really hard to have this universal plan. You kind of all work together, so therefore being like, we're gonna fix yours, but I don't want to pay for mine, it's fine. I mean, is that gonna be, that feels like that's gonna be really tricky.
Well, and it can be, and what you'd have to look at is, there's certain areas where it's easier to be selective versus not. I'll say like this property owner right here at the corner, they have a lot of plantings, vegetation and stuff planted right by the road. It's going to be difficult to rework that. You know, if the grading is such that we don't need to regrade that, where, you know, the ditch is 3 inches higher or 6 inches higher than it should be, but it still drains and they're not flooding, you know, you do run into those areas if you have enough slope that you can make judgment calls like that. It does get trickier and more complicated, and sometimes you just say, no, we got to do it. So it just depends. More of the judgment call where I'd say you really get to say, yeah, we don't want to mess with it, or more of these perimeter ones where you're not really affecting anybody but themselves.
People in the middle, they're affecting people downstream from them or whatever, right?
They can. And there's some instances like the culverts that are reverse slope and those kind of things. If you're going to go out there and do it, you might as well do it and do it right. And in those instances, you just need to do those areas. If you're going to be out there, you're going to want to just fix them. And most of the areas that I had here in green, most of those, once 6 months has passed, you won't even know that it got done. The ditches don't have to be wider or anything. It's just cleaning out the bottom of them. We're not going to be doing significant widening or anything like that. So it's one of those things that if you wanted to proceed ahead with it, for most people, they may not like it because it is getting into the in the longer term, they won't notice it.
So you're not going to make a 5-foot ditch into a 10-foot ditch?
No, we're not taking those kind of extreme changes out there. From our survey looking at it, everything is within 6 inches to 8 inches of where it ought to be. So if we were to widen it, it would probably be 2 feet wider, not 5 feet wider. So, should I jump on to the next one?
Any other questions for this part of the report? Go right ahead.
Okay. So the next one we looked at was 47th and Hillcrest. And on this one here, this one has a lot of slope on it. So I know Ann was kind of questioning me on the way I had this, because you know how you were just talking about, should we just do the whole darn thing, or do you pick and choose where to go? So the green ditches here are areas where regrading is recommended, and there's adequate slope to do it. There's not flat grades or anything like that. The blue areas are areas where I don't necessarily recommend doing any grading. And this area up here, the reason why we didn't recommend it at 48th and Hillcrest is because 48th is paved and there's no storm sewer that's put in to accept the runoff there. So it's kind of just an awkward area where it's, again, Group B soil. So I've never seen standing water there when I drive by there, and I've been driving by there for 19 years, and I don't see standing water problems out there typically. So that area, any work you do there is just going to make a mess and not going to really, you can't make a productive change without paving the road. This area here, we run into, there's a lot of trees on the side of the road. There's no driveways that are really an issue. And this ditch here looks like it's been reworked by this property owner. They redid their driveway culvert and all that. So I don't know that it's going to do much good to do any changes here. This side over here, there's no driveways that front onto the roadway there. So you regrading those would be just, there's no real benefit to it. So I wouldn't recommend that. Now, as we go down the hill here, the nice thing about this hill is pretty steep, and it's got 2 to 3% slope on it, particularly at this northerly end here. And so if you wanted to save money on the project, you could grade like 25 to 50 feet each side of the culvert as you reset them. If you need to do any work with the culvert, grade it out, but there's enough fall that you can catch up in 50 feet and not have to regrade the whole area. So that's why we had these little blue spots here. Now you could it may make sense just to have a contractor, just for the sake of ease, is just go through and redo the whole area just to be uniform. And so you end up with ditches that look the same. So you don't have one area where it's a nice brand new V-bottom ditch, and you have another one where it's kind of more rounded out. So it's optional there as far as that goes. And then once you get to the south end down here, again, the ditches are big enough to carry the flow. There's no driveways being impacted or culverts being impacted, so we don't recommend doing anything there on that. The one thing that we did see that was kind of unusual is, I'm going to say it was this house right here. There's a 50-year-old oak tree or something like that has decided to wrap its roots around the culvert pipe in front of the house. So that's an awkward spot where the good news is the tree root hasn't blocked the flow of the pipe itself. And I think we can grade up either side of it, but realistically that root needs to be cut. But anytime you start taking large roots off trees, it's always a danger to the tree. So that's kind of an awkward one right there that, whether or not that should be done or not, really that probably, it doesn't impact other property owners necessarily. There's enough slope uphill to grade it without taking that out. But it's one of those things that property owner, if I was in their shoes, I'd be thinking, do I need to cut that out? Because at some point that tree could end up destroying the culvert. And it's not quite graded as well as it should be because of that, but it still does work. But it is definitely an awkward spot. And of course, there's my note about the tree wrapped around the culvert there. So on this site here, the green again is culverts that were adequately sized. This blue circle here is one where they don't have a culvert. This one kind of falls again into that optional area. The water coming from this direction actually wraps around and goes this way. And I suspect that based on what I've seen on the grading, the water just kind of spills across the roadway here in the mid block on heavier storm events. What's that? Yeah. Okay, well, and so there is no cross street culvert there, and it looks like the water just kind of spills across the road right in there on larger storm events. The red culverts again are culverts that either had reverse slopes or were undersized. I was really surprised down here. The ones at this end here, those are like 12 and 18-inch culverts, and being at the bottom of the hill there, I was kind of surprised that there were that small culverts, and they are definitely, even though there's good slope on the road, those are all undersized. This one was pretty good. We only had one culvert that had a reverse slope on it, so it was good in that respect. For the most part, other than some awkward grading here because of the vegetation here, this here the outflow from this pond, to get this done right and to keep the water from running across the road, really these two culverts ought to be replaced to get that water to run out to the east a little bit better. Putting another cross street culvert might be an option, but then again, that would just dump more water to the south through people's backyards, which isn't necessarily a great idea. So now in Hillcrest on cost, I'm at $102,000 with my estimate. And again, that does include all the cost and contingencies. We didn't include that one blue culvert that I had shown. That would increase it by $2,200 in this instance. This one, it's 25 lots that are on the project. Estimated cost would be $4,100 per lot, $22 a month. So again, that number is just a perspective number. It's not a decision-making number, or recommendation number. It's just to give you some perspective on cost. So any questions about Hillcrest?
On 48th Street, you're saying those two culverts on the north there near Woodlawn need to be replaced.
Oh, yeah. Here.
Are there what kind of driveways are those? Are those paved driveways, or do you remember?
The ones on the north side were paved. The ones on the south side, I think, were gravel.
Okay, what kind of problems does that create when you have a paved driveway like that? Does it create problems for getting the culvert in?
It depends on the situation. I mean, if it's a concrete driveway, you typically end up having to cut it back to the nearest joint and replace it. Asphalt, you just cut right through it. it's not I wouldn't rate it as any kind of a deal breaker to have to remove them, but there is cost involved with it. I mean, it will, you can easily add on a culvert. I'm trying to do some math in my head. You can end up raising the cost. Every crossing, there's a driveway where you have to do pavement. It's $2,000 or $3,000 probably extra cost when you're dealing with pavement.
I just thought that those were, I didn't know for sure. That's why.
Yeah, and we did, and that's part of what does drive the cost up on these projects is there are some concrete driveways and paved driveways, and that's just doubling your cost of your culvert work when you're doing that.
Okay. Thank you.
And again, I'll just say again, the right solution is to pave the street, but we understand that that's easier said than done on neighborhoods that have been around for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So if there are no other questions on Hillcrest, I'll jump on to Cozy Drive. Cozy Drive is over by Treetop Nursery. It's as far as the projects go, it's overall, and it's probably in the best shape of all of them overall, though it does have the one issue where the area inlet here is built too high when it was installed. It's higher than the street ditch that drains to it. So you can call it a water quality feature. It lets the water sit 2 or 3 inches deep.
Sound like a mosquito nest to me.
Well, again, the nice thing is the type of soils here, it does soak in fast. So that's the positive spin on that. But this area inlet really should be adjusted lower. You can't really raise the ditches. I looked at that, and the driveway into this parking lot is already pretty marginal on cover for the pipe. So you can't raise the pipe. So if you want that ditch, that area inlet to work right, it really needs to be lowered. It does. That's another one of those things that it's maybe more of a public works perception thing. If they're not having problems with it, standing water, let a sleeping dog lie. But we did find that to be low. This area in blue here, this is an area where we had plenty of fall. There is a driveway right here that doesn't have a culvert right now, and we're recommending getting a culvert put in on that. So regrading this section, but that's an area that doesn't really need to be graded. And then up here, there's a big drain swell that runs through here that, so there's really no benefit in grading these because it's already draining into the yard swale there beside it. I will mention that the cross street culvert here is undersized severely and overtops routinely. And I spoke with the gentleman who owns this property, and I was looking at this ditch, and this ditch is overgrown with vegetation. It's kind of a mess. It doesn't look terrible right now because there's no leaves on the trees, but it's a mess. And he said that the city had cleaned it out a while back. It's been a while back, but that it had been cleaned at one point in time, or somebody cleaned it out at one point in time. But you can tell that area could use some cleaning again. It didn't really fall within the scope of what we were looking at, but it's just one of those things I wanted to bring it to your attention, that ditch is pretty overgrown. And I talked to him, and he said that he had actually had a study done by somebody else when he built his garage to make sure that his garage was high enough to stay out of the water. And so the good news is even though it's overgrown and it's a mess, everything's been designed kind of to accommodate it already, for whatever that's worth.
Is that ditch a city right of way, or do we know?
It is actually in city right of way there. You can see the little green lines there. That right of way does wrap around there. It's probably a half street right of way that was dedicated at some point in time, and nothing's ever been done with it. So the culverts here, most of the culverts on this were in good shape, no real issues. Like I mentioned here, the blue culvert is one that we do recommend that a culvert be put under that driveway there. And this red culvert here, it's too small. It should be a larger culvert. And again, there's the area drain we talked about. This driveway here, the culvert I think was adequately sized, but it had a reverse slope on it. So it really needs to be reset to be running in the proper direction. And then that crossroad culvert, like I said, it's undersized. I talked with the homeowner out there, and there's a fire hydrant sitting next to the road, and the hydrant top is about a foot above the road. And he said he's seen it where you could just see the bolt on the top of the hydrant and nothing else because the water runs high enough over there to totally submerge that hydrant. So he did say that this house here, he's seen water get up onto their driveway, not into their house, but get right up to the corner of their garage in the heaviest storm events where it'll just about get into the garage on that house. Cost on this one is $61,000. And the bad thing about projects like this, the smaller they get, your economies of scale start to fall apart. And that cross street culvert pipe is a big deal. That's a high cost. And so this one here, because there's not very many lots involved, is $6,800 per lot, which is $36 a month. I will say that did not include treetop participating. So if you were to ask homeowners and businesses along there to participate, we could certainly, particularly since they have a driveway that goes onto that roadway, have them participate to help defray some of that cost. So that would reduce getting them involved. If they were to take 2 shares, that would probably knock $1,000 per month off the cost, and maybe even a little bit more. But again, that's just a number for perspective on it. The crossroad culverts, the one thing that gets really awkward on these, who owns a driveway culvert? Who's responsible for it? Is it a property owner? Is it the city? Crossroad culverts are more generally, yes, that's a city maintenance issue to look at those kind of things. So, should the crossroad culvert even be included in this cost estimate? Should that be a completely separate item to be considered? That's one of those things you'd want to think about as far as if you wanted to do something about that. What's the best means to do that? Would it be a separate line item on a project or a standalone project? That's things you'd have to think of. So
I'm sure you didn't look at the original engineering on that inlet, but you got the inlet that's installed too high. So
Yeah.
either engineers or contractor or both, who knows?
that one is
But-
maybe there's more potential that maybe the contractor didn't get it dead on because it is above the ditch flow. I don't know the story behind it. I didn't go to the city
Okay.
do any
And-
inquiries on the story behind that, but it's clearly when you look at it, it's 3 inches or so higher than the rest of the ditch upstream. And sometimes it's one of those things, if it had silted in, they go and match the existing ground grade, not realizing that 40 feet away it's lower. And that happens sometimes too when people don't get a survey far enough away from a roadway. So I don't know I'm not theorizing on the whys behind it at this point. We could certainly do more research on that, but it's clearly higher than the ditch upstream.
And to fix it, $6,500,
I think that's the number I put on that, and
That's
we're
what I got
assuming
in
on that.
the spreadsheet here. So,
That was assuming that we would just be a simple saw cut and drop it. We wouldn't have to do any kind of additional modifications to convert it to a filled inlet. It would be just a saw cut it down and drop it down.
okay.
So a little bit cheaper than the other one, because the other one would be actually trying to modify it and put blocking and other stuff to raise the top to make it into a field inlet. So that's why the other one is more expensive on Aurora Park.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Lee?
Okay. So the last item I'll run through real quick is Eagle Lake Outfall Review. I'm going to hang out on this slide a little bit more. I didn't do separate slides on this one. The lake right now was built with the outflow structure here is just a regular round precast concrete manhole that has a metal galvanized steel like water quality structure built above it to keep floatables and other things from being taken downstream. So somebody was trying to be environmentally conscious when they designed this one, and the outfall, the galvanized steel sits about 18 inches above the rim of the manhole there. So what happens in smaller rain events is the water kind of goes underneath that galvanized steel water quality structure and comes up and spills over the top. When you get to larger rain events, it'll eventually fill up and then spill directly into the manhole through the top. So it's only got a 30-inch RCP pipe for an outfall, which for the drainage area upstream, I think it was 100 acres is what I had for my upstream drainage area. That's a pretty small pipe for an outfall. So when I ran my analysis on this, what my analysis is saying is that this lake only really works for the 10-year storm before starting to spill into the overflow spillway. And I had every intention of going and visiting these homeowners to see how often it spills over. I didn't get an opportunity to do that yet, but I've never seen the water spill that, but I have seen water sitting in the sidewalk area really routinely. Every time I ride my bike around the lake down there, I see the water if it's been raining recently. But by the time you get to the 25-year storm, it's spilling out. The 10-year storm works, but by the time you get to the 25-year storm, it's spilling out. And then the 100-year storm, it's definitely spilling out. So one of the things to look at is should this be upgraded and improved to handle a larger storm? The one thing we did see is we had heard that this property owner here had a lot of issues with water getting into their yard. And there's been a swale that's been cut in on the side of the trees here that somebody has cut in. And I don't know exactly when it happened, but it happened after 2008 because it doesn't show up on the 2008 LiDAR. So it was done after that point. And so what we would recommend on this is to further improve that swale a little bit more and get it a little deeper and maybe even extend it maybe even more this way to get more of the runoff that's coming in this field directed directly into the channel rather than spilling into this person's yard. Because I'm sure it is a nuisance in larger rain events where they have a lot of water running into their yard. The good news is we do have pretty good slope from the bottom of this hill here. There's like 3 or 4 feet of fall just in this short distance. So there is plenty of room to create some additional grading. The one thing we did see is this area here, just, decades of turf buildup and sedimentation and such. This area does not drain well. The water sits there. The grass, you can tell, is subjected to water. It's got wet feet all the time, so the grass is not growing well in that area. And you're kind of getting into more of the hydric soils where they're wet quite a bit. So this could use a little additional grading to improve that slope to discourage that water from sitting there so much so the grass grows a little bit better. The thing that I would recommend doing on this, the sidewalk was lowered here to act as the emergency spillway for the pond. And as you guys know, there's standing water on that all the time. So the thing that I would consider doing is putting like 3 pipes underneath here. They wouldn't have to be very long. They wouldn't be really all that expensive to do, but that would allow that sidewalk to be raised up and keep it dry in rain events. So if somebody does happen to go out there right after it rains, they don't have to worry about whether or not it's wet or not. The other thing that might do for the folks downstream is we would allow the pond to still operate and build up head and all that. But depending on how we size these pipes, we may be able to slightly reduce the runoff downstream to improve the downstream condition a little bit. So instead of it, once it reaches the spillway, it's flowing 40 feet wide and can just run out pretty much unrestrained at that point. Putting in a couple pipes might restrain that to the point that it's not a problem. It helps downstream without being a problem for the pond. If we did that, the one thing we would need to do is do a review of the grading around here to make sure that we provide 2 feet of freeboard for the homes out there, because we certainly don't want a situation where we get water close to people's houses. I wouldn't want to do that. I will mention the outflow pipe here. It does come out with enough velocity because this pond there's like a 9-foot grade drop between the top of the outflow structure and the outflow of the pipe. So the water's got a lot of pressure head running through. It's actually blown the end section off the end of that outflow pipe and it's fallen apart and there's scouring downstream. So one of the things that we would recommend is we do this all the time now whenever we have pipes that are coming in this situation, but you'll actually use anchor couplings to anchor it to the pipe upstream so that it doesn't push off again in the future. But that end section really does need to be reset and then anchored to the pipe next to it. And then looking at scouring there, whether or not we'd put in some riprap or some scour protection there, that's another thing that should be considered to be done because of the force of the water running out of there. So, and then on that one, our cost on this, it's relatively small. It's mostly grading. The pipes are fairly short. We're looking at $30,500, and that includes the items that are listed on the screen there, which is regrading that swale, installing some short pipes underneath the sidewalk and elevating that sidewalk, resetting and securing that intersection, installing erosion control BMPs. On that, I don't think you necessarily need to do TRMs, although you could, but you definitely want to do some kind of a Curlex blanket or something to keep that from just getting obliterated as soon as it starts raining. With all the flow that could potentially go through there, you'd want to make sure that it's protected with some Curlex. And then, of course, restoring any the disturbed areas. And I put fescue, but we could have a conversation if there's a different type of link.
So does any of your recommendations on this require the Corps of Engineers?
My preliminary look at it is that at most what we would do is it's main dam, which is a nationwide permit. It's not an individual permit. I've talked with it's a gentleman named Lucius Dirksen. He's in El Dorado. I've talked about it already, and he said that we should be able to do it with just a nationwide permit that wouldn't require any special work. Modifying downstream channels and those kind of things, it gets more complicated. But with the work we're talking here, if we do have to get a permit, it would be what they call nationwide. And the one thing we would do is if when you get ready to pursue this work, we would actually request a jurisdiction to see if we'd even need a permit at all. Because I did a project recently in Andover where I met with Mr. Dirksen out. He took pictures, he looked at historical photographs, and he made the determination that we didn't need to have a permit on the project. So we'll go through that process to make sure what permits we need. And like I said, worst case scenario based on my conversation with him is just a dam maintenance permit, which is just a nationwide permit.
That pipe on the main flow off if you want to back up to the one, I can't quite read it. It's a 30-inch outflow pipe.
Yeah, it's only a 30-inch outflow.
You said
pipe.
that was like a 10-year, and you're recommending leaving it alone? Is that what you said, or you recommend replacing it?
I would not, if we can get it worked out where we would allow the water to stack a little deeper in the lake without getting closer, as long as we can keep at least 2 foot of freeboard to like property lines and those type of things, I would recommend working right here and not getting into the expense of that. Doing that right there will easily double the cost of the project.
That's what I was thinking.
Easily double. That project goes from $30,000 to $60,000 or $70,000. If you start having to drain the entire pond or doing some kind of temporary damming or shoring around it, you're going to spend money real fast trying to replace that pipe with something larger.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Lee?
Now, I wish I could get all 3 projects with the same cost on it, but yeah, when you start running out the numbers, it's when you're talking, I think Aurora Park is like 12,000 feet of ditches. So it's over 2 miles of ditches that we're looking at regrading out there. So it's a substantial project.
Great. Well, I appreciate your work on that. It tells us a lot that we didn't know, and now we know, but now we got to figure out what we want to do about it. So.
Yeah, and I'm always available if you have questions. If you want to reach out via email or go through Ann and run questions through Ann or Ty, however you'd like to do that. I'm happy to answer any questions if you think of anything.
Well,
else.
just to not to lose the opportunity, and I don't want to get into a big thing, but do we have any citizens that would like to address questions on any of these projects? Because I know there are a lot of citizens here tonight, and it looks like they're mostly from Aurora Park, but I don't know that for a fact. So, Dr. Rowe?
So, when you said the city responsibility is met.
Dr. Rowe? Yeah, please come up to
So when you talked about the street culverts being more city responsibility than it is property owners, did that get cut out of the cost for the estimates for that? The culverts are running underneath the street like they're at 37th and Harding?
At this point in time, I just did it as a raw cost for the whole project. I didn't try and break it out into different areas. And that's certainly a point of conversation as far as how you'd want to handle the project. That would be something that would be a point of conversation, is who would be responsible for what cost. So it isn't at this point in time, but that certainly could be done. You're supposed to say your address.
4046 North Hardy,
Thank you.
right in the middle of that thing. So because I know the city has replaced that culvert that runs diagonally across there from the east side to the west side before. I think because it rotted out or rusted out or something and had a big hole in the middle of it. So I know they took on that cost then and it wasn't distributed. And as you know, those culverts are half full of sediment anyway in that area, or collapsed out, or saying so they're, even though they may be undersized, they're half the capacity that they can be. And you've also mentioned that that could be, replacing those is a much more substantial cost than what it is to do the driveway culverts, correct? So that could be make a big difference on that whole overall project. I don't know how many under the street culverts you were mentioning there, but it seemed like there was a few in there.
So going back, the culvert, the cross street culvert there needs to be replaced. This one is marked as green, but this culvert isn't in the greatest shape and may need to be replaced as well. This cross street culvert definitely needs to be replaced. Well, it's not terrible. It's a 30 inch. It really ought to be a 36-inch pipe. So it's not terrible. It probably works the vast majority of the time. So there aren't really all that many cross street culverts that are involved in the project as far as that goes.
If you go back down to 37th and Harding right there, that green dot right there by the red one that runs north to south, that one is collapsed almost completely in that area. But it doesn't, you've got that marked as green, which indicates that they're adequately sized.
Well, and some of those, you know, we may get when we're digging them out. You may find other ones that are more damaged as it goes along. And so some of these, when we get to our final plan, we may have a few more that end up being done. That's part of why we do contingencies too, is to cover the cost of any of those that we might have missed in our first pass through.
And I know you looked at a lot of those, but do you remember that? I remember you guys were out there standing looking at that corner that day, but I don't know if you remember that one.
I don't remember it being completely collapsed. I wouldn't.
But I'll tell you, it's at least 25% sitting in sediment.
Oh, no, every bit of that. Yeah, no doubt. There's, like I said, every bit of ditch out there is 6 inches to 8 inches deep. And a lot of that culverts, that means they're half full, because a lot of those culverts are 12-inch culverts. So that means they're over half full if it's 8 inches deep. So a lot of the culverts on this side are undoubtedly half buried. There's a couple of them. There was one or two that we found where they're completely buried completely, where you can only just see the top of the culvert and nothing else. And so some of those, you know, we got the size of them, but, you know, knowing the exact condition in the middle of it, some of those, it's a little trickier. So.
And on that TRM, is there soil on top of that TRM?
It depends on the design. Some of them do put soil on top. Generally, generally they go on top of the soil. Some of them are more of a honeycomb matrix where the soil fills in the middle of it.
Grass growing.
So the grass grows through those. It depends on the style. There's different styles.
Yes.
I'm
Please state your name and address.
Carolyn
Dr.
Genselman, 5029 I have a green and a red culvert. My question about the ditch clean out is, like right now, our ditch is very nicely sloped. We can get in there and with push mower do both sides. Some of the neighbors have to get in there with a weed eater and can't even get a mower down in. So when you're cleaning those out, what does it end up looking like? Is it where you can't get a mower all the way to the bottom, or is it sloped enough to where you can?
I was told they're all supposed to be mowable.
Well, one of the conversations I had with Ann on that was looking is what would the slopes would do, and we would normally recommend around a 4-to-1 slope. And a 4-to-1 slope means for every 4 feet over, it's 1 foot down, which is uncomfortable to ride on, but it's mowable.
Okay.
Now, if you have a really wide area where it's really, really wide, it's easier to kind of blade it out to maybe more match the existing ground a little bit. So some of that can turn into a little bit of the contractor when they're doing it, they can kind of blade it in. But I would generally say we're going to have 4-to-1 slopes is what we're designing for. So so steep but mowable is what we're going for. 3-to-1 is the one where you get on it and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to fall over for sure. And specifically said she didn't want that kind of situation where people felt unsafe.
So then my other question would be that they came recently and removed all of the grass between the road and the ditch. They brought the road all the way to the ditch. When you clean those ditches out, where is the clearance between the road and the ditch? I mean, or is there one?
We in general, I'm expecting most of the work to happen on the property side.
Okay.
But if there's areas where it's too steep on the street side, it may end up getting cut even there a little bit. But most of this, I expect it'll go out to the property side. And again, since we're only talking 6 inches of cut, we're not talking dramatic changes into the yards. It's probably 2 to 3 feet is all we're really thinking is what we're looking at on that is typical. And some of the ditches, it's more that they're rounded, they're not cut sharper. And when we do these, normally they'll be more cut in as V ditches. Because in a perfect world, we'd go with 4-foot flat bottom, but at that point you're starting to really get into folks' yards and we'd be unpopular really fast then. So
You wouldn't see a mile.
So, but in general though, they would try and our recommendations would always be to try and match the natural conditions as much as possible, but we would be 4-to-1 max.
Bonnie Stinson.
Hi, my name's Bonnie Stinson. I live at 3800 North Harding. And I just want to tell everyone here, I'm glad you guys decided to do the ditch survey. You really didn't need to. I told you it wasn't called, nobody really asked for it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But it does kind of hit home about our road flooding all the time. I think he's kind of confirmed some of what we've been feeling for a while. I do want to tell Mr. Garver, I've got several, I broke my pen. I have several pictures I would be more than happy to share with you. I also, at the time 37th Street was being done, I called the project manager of Wichita, and he told me that while he was talking to me on the phone, he looked it up and he goes, oh, there's a bunch of lakes up there. And I said, yeah. Well, I said, are you taking any of that into consideration? He said, no, the money we got was to do 37th Street. We're not concerned with the Bel Aire side. And I said, okay. So I don't even know if they were aware, looked, whatever. The response I got was not positive in that regard. I also know that when they were putting the culvert in, or that flat grate thing in, I actually have pictures of when they set everything down in. I got out with my camera and I took it at different stages. I took it at the end of everything, and you can see where that thing sits so much lower than where the ditch actually goes, that we kept telling them it's not going to handle the flow, and it wasn't their problem, I guess. They didn't care. So I do have pictures for that too. I want to tell you the TRM, if you do it around our house, my husband's going to have a small coronary. We had that done when they did 37th, and it messed the lawnmower up. The netting came, stuff was flying everywhere. And we're not big advocates of it just based on our personal experience with it. I can tell you, I have a picture of one of the maintenance workers trying to unplug that grate one day. They took a bucket, he's in the bucket, and they swung it over because it was so deep, they couldn't get in there to clean it out. Took the bucket and he hung over the edge and got it unplugged. So the water is coming down. It's not a 10-year event. It's a yearly event. It's more than once during the year. And right now, I think we've just decided that it's always going to flood, so we'll just put up with it. But I continue to send to people. And I also, down around that grade and where I'm talking about is right at 37th. Okay, I'm right there on the corner. Yeah. And what the deal is there is part of the way in, and then it goes to dirt. The road is actually level with what's supposed to be a ditch, kind of, it just kind of, so I don't know if you looked at that. I know you're in the preliminary stages. If you get that far, I don't know you never said anything about building a road up. I don't know if that's in the plan or if it's just the drainage part. But it seems like the road is even. So when it does flood, the water takes the path of least resistance and it's right across the front of that pavement. Okay. And then my last question is, now that you know about the areas and the problems they're experiencing, where would you buy your next house, and which area would you buy it in? That's all I had to say. Thank you.
Well, first, I don't provide real estate recommendations. But as far as the road grading out here, we aren't proposing any adjustments to road grades in particular out here with the work we're doing. We're not planning on doing any adjustments to road profiles themselves. In terms of the grading at the south end, I can't recall off the top of my head the exact depth of the inlet compared to the edge of the roadway there. I will say that I've driven that several different times over the course of looking at this project, and I don't remember any particular ride issues where I thought this needs to be regraded. I didn't see anything like that. Trying to raise that road grade could end up actually creating more problems, because if you start raising the road grade, you're more likely to start pushing dirt and gravel out into 37th Street, which, would create frustration in a different fashion. So I don't know that I'd recommend changing the grade of that road. I think we'd more look, if we were doing something, we'd want to look more at modifying ditch grades.
Ms. Betty Martine.
Betty Martine, 4701 North Woodlawn. Could you take that back to 47?
The ditches or the culverts?
Well, I want to go to 47th and Woodlawn.
Oh, 47th.
Okay. The little gentleman that lives right there where Red Dot is, when he moved to Bel Aire, he took the culvert out and he put in a shed. So therefore, from 47th, let's see, the third and fourth house, we get all the runoff. And several people in Bel Aire have seen my yard clear up to the house with water standing if the rain is pretty hard.
You're talking about the cross street culvert right there. Is that the culvert?
Well, not the house on the corner, but the house right there.
It's right there, that cross street culvert right there. And I will say that I was surprised when I went out there and there was no cross street culvert, because I was thinking, that would have been a natural spot for one.
Right, because he took it out to build a little shop.
Yeah.
Not the house on the corner of Woodlawn 47th,
Yeah.
but the house right next to it. So
Yeah.
therefore, when Mrs. Poulter lived here, she had a barn almost clear back to the side of the property. Part of it had a wooden floor because we had horses, and the other part was concrete. She replaced that wood in that barn twice from this rot out.
Yes.
And then I know as it comes down to 45th, Eckerd's house that bought postal weights now, and then my house, which is a rental, and then Brookhouser's house, all go underwater. How Eckerd's keeps the swimming pool, I don't know. But it's bad. Something very because all those houses slant down.
Well, and that's the one thing I guess I'll mention again. These two culverts here aren't really designed for the runoff to be carried out that way. The one thing that we are recommending is looking at trying to improve that grading along that north ditch there to try and get more of the water past those two driveways, so you have less of it that's running to the south. So
when the culvert was there, it went to running good.
yeah, and there's still that what we found is these culverts look like they're undersized, like they've been replaced. Like unfortunately, they have really nice new driveways there that have. So, but yeah, I do agree that there is more water that does run down to the south with the way it's designed, just because the way the grading is. I could picture that water overtopping the road and running to the south.
If it comes into my house, I'll call you.
I didn't know it wasn't me.
Any more questions or discussions from Mr. Lee, from the public, or from council members?
Well, I'll just finish up by saying I appreciate you giving me the time to come here and talk tonight. I hope that it brought to light a couple things, and it probably reinforced things you already knew as much as anything else. I will say that I'll talk with Ann before we get out of here. If there's folks that want to share pictures, I don't know if it's more appropriate to have them send it to Ann and then to me, or if to me directly. I don't know the best process for that. So it may be best to send them to Ann, and then she can disperse them to me as well. So if you and that can happen too. But as much as possible, we do want to make sure that the city's involved with any kind of communications as much as possible. And it's just so they do know if there's questions or concerns, that they are aware of it as well. So, but again, I appreciate the time tonight. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Do we want to have any additional discussion about this particular subject tonight? I mean, there's a lot to digest there, but we haven't even broached the idea of how you finance or pay for this, or how you approach these projects, or any of that kind of a thing. Right now, we just have some ideas and concepts out there to pursue, and I hate to have spent the money for this, and then it's set on the shelf.
Mr. Mayor,
Mr. Smith,
can I ask a question to our city engineer on this topic?
certainly.
I guess my question is, now that we have this plan, there's the option to go do the really large project and tackle it all at once. Is there anything that's actionable from a staff perspective at this point?
There are several areas of action at this point. A lot of it depends on the will of the council. If you started to read my report on the public works projects, there is an allowance for doing some of this work. My suggestion would be to have Mr. Lee finish the report, and let's pick, there's some things we can easily pick off. There's a couple inlets that need to be lowered and raised. Those can be done fairly simply. And then let's start looking at starting from the bottom, the lowest point, and working back. If we just look at maybe doing one block of ditches, we can certainly go out for a few contractors, and if not ask for a specific bid, at least talk to them. Say, hey, can you give me a ballpark number, what this would cost? And then we can come back. I try not to go to contractors too many times asking for ballparks if we're not going to do anything, because it irritates them and we don't get as good of help next time. But we are working with a few contractors that they would be willing to give us some rough numbers and not spend a whole lot of time, but at least give us some planning numbers. So yes, there are definitely things
Well,
that we
and
can do.
the other part of my question, I think, was, I know you guys get called out when there are certain issues. Is there anything that your staff will leverage this report for, once it's finalized?
Definitely. Some of the culverts that Mr. Lee had brought up being undersized are ones that we've actually replaced within the past 5 years since I've been here. We replaced like with like. So we never downsize. If we're going to do anything, we're going to upsize it or replace it with the same size. So it will certainly help inform our operations moving into the future. If there are culverts that need to be replaced, then we will definitely look at his report and know what size we need to go back with. We also have had recently, one of the property owners, a new property owner over in Aurora Park, had just purchased a house, wanted to put in a new driveway that needed a culvert, and he asked what size. Well, he needed to go out and get an engineering study done to tell him what size. And so this helped that property owner specifically know what size of culvert to put in. If I'm asked the question, I say, what's the size of the culvert down street? And that's, you don't put anything less than that. So, you know, if you've got culverts that are undersized down street, and that's because it's the easiest, it's the least time consuming, I don't have to go through and do a huge study, then, you know, we're just compounding the problem. We're certainly not making it any better, but we're not making it that much worse if it's what's already there, so.
So if I reading correctly, what you're suggesting is that let's get the final report, and then you would go through that report and say, here's what we can do, and here's a plan for implementation, and you would bring that back to us to discuss?
Yes, after our discussion tonight on the public works projects and kind of what the council's vision is for the storm sewer, I know there's a few other projects that we need to get done. We can look at how much money is available, and then I can kind of take the final report, and then we can move forward. It's also going to be a council decision as to payment. You know, it's my opinion, as is Mr. Lee's, that the crossroad culverts are 100% the city's. There is some question on the driveway culverts. Whose responsibility is that? That's a question that council will need to discuss and answer and that would inform me as to how kind of we move forward with some of these projects.
Very good, thank you.
You're
Are
welcome.
those, do we know, are those driveway culverts, those in city right away, or those are property owners right away?
They are in city right away.
Thank you. Anything else on this particular topic? If not, I'll recommend we move on to the next project, which is the next item on the agenda, which is the 2021 road projects. And do we want to take a short break before we do this?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
do we have an estimate on how long we might think that next agenda item might take?
Yeah.
I have this broken up per department. So I have sanitary sewer, water, parks, storm sewer, roads. I would suggest we take it kind of department by department. And then after each department, have a discussion and say, do we want to continue or do we want to hold this off to another time? None of these items are terribly urgent that cannot wait. So depending on the will of the council, that would be my suggestion, at least start moving through this.
Thank you for that. The reason I ask is I think we could spend a lot of time discussing this, and I know we said we wanted to revisit our timing after each agenda item. So
Right, I think
I
that's
want to make sure that we actually want to move on to this, considering the other lengthy discussion we'll likely have tonight.
Sure. So is that how we want to approach that then? Look at it project by project and see where we are? Okay, very good. Let's take a 5-minute break and reconvene here at 8:37, if we can be so precise.
I see you're still sliding.
some things for us.
Right, well, it's not just road project, it is the public works project.
All right.
So starting off with the sanitary sewer, and in the interest of time, I'm not gonna read through all of our accomplishments, et cetera. You're all aware of them, but for the public, we lined 140 sewer manholes, we lined the lift station, we installed new bypass fittings at 53rd and Rock Road lift stations. We cleaned approximately 7,200 feet of pipe. We cleared 3 sewer backups and replaced a pump at 53rd with a new pump that has a cutter head. The budget, lift station operation, 60,000. Wastewater system maintenance and repair, 150,000. And sewer system
Improvements, 300,000. So there's quite a bit of money sitting there. Our plan for this year is to continue the cured in place pipelining project. This is mostly in the Pearson's division. And this stretch identifies approximately 9,000 feet of pipe that needs, and this is not it. Oh, okay. Oh, maybe not. Okay. There's approximately 9,000 feet of pipe that we have identified that is kind of the next to worst areas that need to be lined. We anticipate that work costing about $320,000. Now, there's always more pipe that can be lined, so, but we did want to make sure that we saved money in the budget for any lift station, knock on wood, needs. We're hoping we're beyond that, but you never know, and I don't want to cut ourselves short. We do need to line the Rock Road lift station, the wet well with epoxy liner, like we did over on 53rd Street. This is kind of the next lift station. Harding is the most used lift station. 53rd is second, and then Rock Road would be the third most busy volume-wise lift station that we have. So we would recommend getting that lined. Based on the cost of the 53rd Street lift station, we anticipate that being about $25,000 to line. We also need to clean all of our lift stations about 3 to 4 times a year. Staff monitors these lift stations on a daily basis. They actually open up and check the level of the wet well, the amount of grease built up, probably bi-weekly to weekly basis. So they're monitoring these, and it's pretty obvious when it needs to be cleaned. There's a lot of grease that builds up on the side of the walls. And that we anticipate being between $14,000 and $18,000, depending on whether we clean 2 lift stations, whether we clean all 4 lift stations, whether we do it 3 times a year or 4 times a year. The other item would be to continue the in-house sewer cleaning program with our sewer cleaner. We would be targeting the lines in Central Park, Aurora Park, and Lawn Terrace. We have already started cleaning the lines in Central Park. So that's kind of our plan for the sewer department. Does anybody have any questions on that plan or comments?
Well, I'm glad to see that you're looking at some preventive maintenance on those lift stations. That's a great thing. So
Yes.
help maybe reduce some of the failures, unexpected failures, right?
Yes.
Mr. Mayor. The cured in place pipelining program, do we have a projection as to how many years it'll be before we complete that program at our current pace?
No.
Okay.
It all, I mean, it all, just kind of like the streets, it all depends on the amount of budget available at any given time and how much we can put towards it. The pipes that we focus on are the clay pipes and not necessarily the PVC, because we generally don't have the problems. They have a tighter seal between the pipes, whereas the clay pipes are a little bit looser and more brittle and break easily. They're much easier for roots to intrude than PVC pipes.
Do you have a perspective as to the clay pipes? Are we 20% done, 50% done, 80% done?
I do not. I don't believe we actually have like a spreadsheet type of inventory. I know several of our maps say clay, PVC, other types, but I don't think we have a good inventory. I can certainly take a look and we can get that for council for your information, so you have that number available.
I was just curious, you know, what the program length of this would be. So
Sure.
thank you.
Is this a program that you're like, not only do you not know how long it goes, is this something that just continually happens forever and it's just a matter of how much money gets spent on it year to year that continually needs to be done? Or are you actually seeing there will likely be some sort of end date that we may not do it for a number of years in a row? Or do you think, no, there may be a year we don't do it, but this is something you kind of always do?
I would anticipate that there will be an end date in sight. Generally, as I'd mentioned, it's the clay pipes that we line. There is some thin-walled PVC that has been used. It was kind of at the very beginning of the development of the PVC pipe that we may consider lining 5-10 years in the future. But right now, we're targeting those clay lines that are the oldest lines in the system and have the most problems.
I am super glad that we're doing this program. I think it's an excellent investment for the city, and I'm glad that we're able to budget for it. I was just curious as to duration, out of curiosity.
Always great to see maintenance items in the budget rather than emergency items in the budget. So.
Well, that's my next question. It looks like we've reserved quite a bit of money for emergencies. Is that?
Yes, and part of that was just, we've had an idea of how much it would cost, and then we put pipes lengths to it and then came back, and it was just kind of not following that iteration through. It's also difficult to figure out how much we need to reserve. We bought a pump last year that was $60,000. Are we gonna have to buy another pump this year? I certainly hope not, but you never know. And I'd rather have a little bit of money left in reserve, and then we can either hold it into next year, put it into a different capital improvement program, or work with Ted working his magic. You know, it doesn't just disappear. It's saved for other uses and kind of doing some more plans in the future. I don't want to build up a budget that we're $100 from that line item or even $2,000 because you just don't know.
Yes, I appreciate that. I just wanted to make sure that I was reading it right.
Yes. And we can certainly look at putting a few more, maybe another 500 to 1,000 feet of pipe in there. It just kind of depends on what we've got and what's the next one in line. Also depends on what the bids come in at. These bids are an estimate based on what we did 2 years ago. They may be higher, they may be lower. I don't know.
Well, I do appreciate your looking out for that, because I know there have been a couple projects where you found those bids came in a lot lower and you said, hey, let's do some more.
Exactly.
Because we already had the funds available, so we
And
did.
contractors
That-
never, never deny more work, or very rarely. So if everybody's good with that, we've got 10 minutes if you want to end at 9 to move on to the water system.
Keep going.
All right.
Hey.
In 2020, we installed about 1,800 linear feet of water lines in the Aurora Park addition. We replaced 3 fire hydrants and installed about 80 new water services. We completed the maintenance on the North Water Tower, which included cleaning the interior of the tanks and performing an inspection. We cleaned the exterior of the South Water Tower. And this is the first year in staff's memory that we have reached the water target for both Wichita and CCUA. We pretty much always have to pay for water that we don't use because we didn't reach that target. We actually paid for all the water that we used, which is wonderful. We actually had a little bit of an issue where we overran CCUA and had a kind of a slight emergency and said, what are we doing here? But that was easily solved. Staff continue their regular testing for bacteria, disinfection byproducts, and unregulated contaminants. All testing passed and no concerns were noted. Staff also exercised the valves in the Sunflower Commerce Park and the Rock Spring additions. The water department budget is $150,000 for water system maintenance and repair, and $246,000 for water system improvements. Both of those numbers are kind of combined into what number is available. I did leave out the funds for the water tower because that is a separate contract that is already being paid for separately.
Just to clarify on the water towers, those are long-term contracts that they do the maintenance on both towers?
Correct. I believe they're 8 to 10-year contracts that are for the maintenance specifically.
Thank you.
So in 2021, we propose our first priority is replacing the water line on 41st Street between Danbury and Edgemore. This is a water line that we had a leak on a few weeks ago, and staff did not realize how bad of a condition it was in. So that is our top priority for this year, $103,500. We also would like to replace the water line on 40th Street between Oliver and Harding, which is in Aurora Park, for $69,000. And on Batten from Harding to the dead end for about $127,600. That will finish out Aurora Park, and that will replace about 30 some water meters that are of the old style and that are read with handhelds and not automatically read. So that will help staff out. We'd also want to replace about 58 of the old meters with the remote read capabilities. Those are meters that are not in Aurora Park and not associated with these other water line replacements. We anticipate that costing about $25,600. With that, does council have any questions?
What is the cost of one of those meters that's remote read?
It is about, I believe it's about $2,000 to $2,000 to $3,000. I've got the number back at my desk, but did not bring it with me.
So when you replace those, the real advantage is that we don't have to go out there and actually physically read it. We get the.
Correct.
Or some fashion. I don't know how it's transmitted, but there's a way it's transmitted.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
And I would
Fair.
imagine those last long enough that they might pay for themselves in staff time.
Yes, they are scheduled to last roughly about 10 years. Oh, yeah, as Ted mentioned, and I'm sure the public didn't hear, but it does not require staff to go out to each individual meter to take a reading and then to come back. And when you're handwriting in the field, sometimes a 7 looks like a 6 and you can't quite, or 5 looks like a 6 and you can't quite tell the number. So it's much more accurate too. And it allows, if residents have a question saying, I used an awful lot of water this month, staff can go back, pull it up on the computer system, and we could get a printout of each day of the daily use and have a much more accurate measure for the citizens to look at and saying, oh, well, at 10 o'clock every night, we run the dishwasher and clothes washer, and so we're seeing a spike. You can see those type of things. We obviously don't know exactly what the resident.
How many non-remote read meters will we have left once this is complete?
I believe this replaces the majority of the residential ones. The commercial water meters, per our water code and our water policy, are technically supposed to be replaced by it's the responsibility of that property owner to replace those. That is something that I have had conversations with our city attorney about, just kind of in the side, and as we have reviewed the water policy. That's something that I would really like to see changed, because I don't know about you, I don't want to pay for a water meter. My water meter's working fine. It's not broke, but there's a lot of advantages to getting that done. And so even if we raise the water bills on commercial properties, I don't know, I'm just going to throw this number out there, maybe $1 a month. We'd have to work with Ted and see, would that pay for it? How much money? Because it just saves staff time a lot. And if we replace those on a regular basis, 10, 15 years, then the entire city is much better off, much more accurate.
Is the majority of the cost of replacing that the hardware or the labor to install it?
It really depends on the situation. There are, for the residential meters that are detailed in this report, it's pretty much all the hardware. The time would be staff time, and that's already been paid for by the city. It's just comes from different projects. But on commercial properties, a lot of times, especially in the area of Buck Alley over at Woodlawn and 37th, a lot of those are in concrete. And so in order to replace the meter, you've got to kind of dig up a little bit of concrete and adjust the meter, get in there. They're harder to replace, and some of them, they need a little bit of work on the service itself to be able to accept that new meter. Some of them are buried and we can't get to. So there is a little bit more cost with those commercial meters, but from my opinion, it's very well worth it.
And is there a significant cost difference in replacing a meter with a remote read meter versus a non-remote read meter?
I believe it's about $500.
I was just doing the quick math. $2,000 a meter for 10 years is, $200 a year for your water meter, which is pretty substantial, more than I was expecting, just with the rough math. So appreciate that insight.
You're welcome.
So did you say you had a program where commercial meters are being replaced every periodic time?
No,
Okay.
there is no program at this point. The water policy does have a few sentences in there, but it's very old. And when it was written, it wasn't, I'm going to say, well thought out. Always as time goes on, you learn more, you see more, you know more. And so you can put more thought and have a better policy, more well-rounded. But it wasn't quite there when the policy was originally written. So that's something that the next time we consider looking at the water policy, it's something that we definitely need to consider doing.
Okay.
Did you say some of the commercial ones are like pretty much buried in concrete and things like that, or sad?
Yes, I know there is one location that the city had, we actually went ahead and replaced that meter because we couldn't read it at all. And so, and we found out that that was pretty much encased in concrete, and we had to, I don't remember exactly what the fix was, but I remember we had to do something there.
Should your policy have some kinds of specifications that you can't do that, or,
It certainly was not an intentional or project, but yes.
Oh. Okay. Well, it's a thought
Sure.
going forward.
Yeah, definitely.
That's all.
Any other questions or discussions on the water distribution system? Okay, hearing none, do we want to move on to streets, or do we want to adjourn, or what's the feel of the council?
Follow the plan here in this. We're not streets isn't next.
Isn't? What I mean?
We've got storm sewer.
Storm sewer.
Oh, okay, I looked, sorry. I looked right past that one. Okay, sorry.
I think looking at the clock, it would be wise to kind of pause the discussion and pick this one up next time.
Okay.
Can we afford to wait a month?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you'd indicated that there wasn't anything urgent on here tonight, right?
Correct. All of these numbers are kind of budget numbers. We have not obtained bids for any of these, not knowing quite where the direction of the council would be going. And so we're definitely okay waiting a month.
What's the status on Batten?
Batten, I have a meeting tomorrow, and we'll talk with Kansas Paving about their start date.
70-degree days. You wonder if we can't get started.
80 tomorrow.
Yeah, maybe tomorrow, yesterday.
The problem with that is even if there's 70-degree days, we have about a 2 to 3 week window because we need to advertise for a pre-construction meeting, public meeting, so the public knows what the plans are, where they're going. That's going to take about a week, depending on whether we have an 100% of some version of an online in-person meeting. You know, if it's an online meeting, it can last for about a week, have question answers opened for that period, and then give property owners about a week to prepare for their project.
And
So-
the soil temperature's high enough.
It's more the asphalt company, or I guess, never mind, we're not using asphalt, we're using concrete. But it's, yes, soil temperatures, that's not so much a part of it. But you do need the ambient air temperature to be up enough that you can get a good cure on that concrete and don't have any detrimental effects due to the cold weather.
Okay, so we can move as fast as possible to avoid the rainy season.
Correct.
Good. All right, thank you. And
You're welcome.
we'll end the workshop and reconvene the special council meeting. I have 9:02. I'm going to call the special council meeting back to order at 9:02. And last I heard, we were wanting to go back into an executive session.
Mr. Mayor,
Dr. Schroeder.
my motion, we continue the executive session that we had earlier for a period of 30 minutes, which will end at 9.